It has been realized for some time that the hydrodynamics of the liquid core of the Earth are of very great importance, that the state of motion of the liquid core of the Earth is a very complicated motion where mechanical and electrical...
The only known recording of John von Neumann speaking on a scholarly subject.
...class called turbulent. We know, it seems extremely likely that this is responsible for the main phenomena of terrestrial magnetism, and that this is also important for a number of other reasons. The calculations are very difficult and can probably only be done in a three-dimensional sense, and the pioneer efforts which have been made in this field have all tended to show how difficult it is and what extensive numerical problems arise. It is quite typical that this type of problem, again, becomes probably accessible for the first time now.
John von Neumann, 1903 to 1957. The quality and range of John von Neumann's work earned him an undisputed place among the first rank of mathematicians in the 20th century. His ultimate place in the history of mathematics and science can only be decided by time itself. A colleague, Paul Halmos, sums up the qualities of his mind in this way.
You could practically see Johnny, imagine Johnny with a checklist before him as he was going down through various human disciplines, mathematics, physics, chemistry, economics. I've done that one, I've done that one. Kept looking around for green fields to conquer. I don't know if it was personal ambition or a tremendous intellectual curiosity. He had that. He was an amateur historian and an amateur this and that. He loved to know about things, but I think to some extent at least it was that he wanted to make his mark in everything. He was striving to be a universalist. And that's a very hard thing to be in the 20th century. He came close.
While still in his 20s, von Neumann had already solved Hilbert's fifth problem for compact groups, proved the mean ergodic theorem, provided a mathematical foundation for quantum theory, proved the minimax theorem in theory of games, and done basic work in foundations of mathematics. Later contributions include the classic treatise on game theory, and such topics as rings of operators, lattice theory, shock waves, hydrodynamics, astrophysics, weather control, atomic energy, computer technology, and theory of automata. He was president of the American Mathematical Society, served as top-level consultant to government and industry, and as his prestige grew, became the moving force behind key government decisions. Among many honors, he received the first Enrico Fermi Award. And in 1956, shortly before his death, the Freedom Medal. Stanislav Ulam, a close friend and colleague for many years, remembers von Neumann's personal qualities this way.
Johnny's friends remember him in his characteristic poses, standing before a blackboard or discussing problems at home. Somehow, his gesture, smile, and the expression of his eyes always reflected the kind of thought or the nature of the problem under discussion. He was of middle size, quite slim as a very young man, then increasingly corpulent. Moving about in small steps with considerable random acceleration, but never with great speed. A smile flashed on his face whenever a problem exhibited features of a logical or mathematical paradox. Quite independent of his liking for abstract wit, he had a strong appreciation, one might say almost a hunger, for the more earthy type of comedy and humor. His conversations with friends on scientific subjects could last for hours. There never was a lack of subjects, even when one departed from mathematical topics. Johnny had a vivid interest in people and delighted in gossip. One often had the feeling that in his memory he was making a collection of human peculiarities as if preparing a statistical study.
At the time of his death, von Neumann's peers considered him among the world's greatest living mathematicians. Yet he was virtually unknown to the general public. A year-long search for film material turned up only these excerpts from a 1955 TV program, Youth Wants to Know, in which all that the young participants knew about him was that he was an AEC commissioner and a very polite and patient man.
Bill, did you have a quick question there?
We have been seeing all these mechanical instruments and everything, and how are they educating more people to operate these instruments? Is there enough people to do it? Or
I'm glad that you're asking this question, because it's really a very good one. No, we don't have enough people, and we better do something about it. And I hesitate to say that we better do something about it quickly, but rather we better do something about it both quickly and then continuously. In other words, we need more training in science on all levels, in college, in the high schools, and more training of high school teachers. All along the line will have to accelerate a great deal.
Bill, do you think you might get into that sort of field?
No, sir, I'm sort of interested in law a little bit.
He's a lawyer from Arkansas, Dr. von Neumann. You're not going to be an engineer, huh?
No, sir. Do you think that more scholarships would help a whole lot if we had a whole lot more scholarships?
Yes, more scholarships would be very important and would be very helpful. But you must also remember that the scholarships help you only at the end of this process. And that before this, one needs very good training in secondary schools. Otherwise, you may never discover that you have that ability. Also, one needs more training of teachers for the high schools, because otherwise the high schools never get to that point.
Come on over here,
so
Barbara.
it will have to affect a whole lot of things.
We might move over and take a look at a few other things, and
Yes.
for the moment we'll leave this general dynamics exhibit, go over here to an exhibit we have here. This is the electronics exhibit, whereby, as you see, they have a number of gadgets, I guess you might call them that, or is that the wrong word?
No,
to say?
I think it's the right one.
This is what they tell me is a scintillator. Now, what do they do with that, Dr. von Neumann?
Well, these are, I think, all counting instruments with which you determine the radiation level.
All counting instruments,
Except this, which seems to be just a carrying case.
Walt, does that look like you could carry that around? Do you want to see if you can pick that up? Huh? I think maybe you better leave it there, Walt. They tell me that is encased with lead.
I believe you.
It does indeed. And let's go over here now to a few other exhibits we have on this other side. Come on there, girls. Come on, Julia. Come on, Ela, Bill, Jimmy, Bob. Let's go over here to this side, and we have a few other youngsters over here, Doctor. Let's watch that cable. That's the fine thing. We don't want to wind up with a broken leg. You might come over here, sir, if you will. That's fine, and you youngsters can come over here on my left and right. This is another exhibit, Dr. von Neumann.
When von Neumann was no older than these students, not quite 18, he published his first paper. Stanislav Ulam comments on this early work in Set Theory and Foundations of Mathematics.
I think one can say, really without any exaggeration, that von Neumann exemplified and typified the spirit of mathematics in the 20th century. In his early work, it was set theory and foundations of mathematical logic which occupied him, and the program which started with Cantor's creation of set theory, then taken up and developed by Hilbert, of axiomatizing mathematics, all of mathematics, and putting it on a firm, steady, and unique basis, was really brought to completion, in a sense, or perfection, by wonderful technical achievements of John von Neumann, still a very young man in the middle and late 20s. Von Neumann wrote several papers in which the axiomatic method, as pertaining to all of mathematics, was put on a perhaps most technically sound and elegant basis. Hilbert's program was, of course, assuming a belief, which Hilbert himself stated explicitly, there will be no ignorabimus in mathematics, that all meaningful statements will ultimately be decidable. It was the discovery of Gödel, which came later in 1930, which changed or really shattered this belief. Von Neumann, of course, recognized immediately the importance, overwhelming importance of this point of view. He was, in fact, a little bit disappointed that he himself did not see this other possibility. Gödel's result was that there will always be in sufficiently large mathematical systems statements which can neither be proved nor disproved within the system. But this merely confirmed and stimulated von Neumann in his work of making large parts of mathematics more constructive and more explicit.
John von Neumann was born in Budapest, Hungary, December 28, 1903. Budapest, at the turn of the century, was an exceptionally fertile breeding ground for an entire generation of brilliant scientific minds. Eugene Wigner, Edward Teller, Theodor von Karman, Leo Szilard, to name a few. John von Neumann was perhaps the most brilliant star in this constellation. Von Neumann was the first of 3 sons in a wealthy Jewish family. His father, Max von Neumann, was a banker, a self-made man. His mother, Margaret Kahn, was a strong and dominant personality to whom von Neumann was deeply attached. Despite the political ferment of the times, Janci, as he was called, led a childhood of sheltered opulence. Summers were spent with his many cousins in a country villa or on the Lido beach in Venice. It was clear that he was a prodigy in mathematics from his early years. At 17, when he graduated from the gymnasium, he was already recognized as a professional mathematician. Nevertheless, he decided to cover himself by studying chemical engineering in Zurich. In 1925, he collected his degree from the University of Zurich and simultaneously a PhD in mathematics from the University of Budapest. Inevitably, he was drawn to Göttingen, where, under Hilbert, he wrote his first paper on quantum mechanics. He continued this work at the University of Berlin, where in 1924 he became the youngest Privatdozent in the university's history. Several papers on the subject were co-authored with a schoolmate from gymnasium days in Budapest, Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner.
I am a physicist and he was a mathematician, and I can comment with any competence whatever only about his contributions to physics. These were, I could say, of 3 kinds. 2 of these are indirect and one type of contributions is direct. First, he contributed to physics by the mathematics that he created. He created the theory of unbounded operators. He contributed very greatly to the theory of group representations in Hilbert space and to the theory of ergodic systems. He liked the encouragement of physics or of concrete thinking on mathematics. He always said that if mathematics is left to itself and has to develop out of itself, it becomes baroque and uninteresting, and his liking not only for physics but also for other branches of knowledge, in particular economics, was based on this circumstance. The second type of contributions which he made to physics was made simply by being a mathematician interested deeply in physics. He convinced us that rigorous thinking creates distinctions not present in our usual, more sloppy thinking as physicists. This type of contribution was not as evident during Johnny's lifetime as it became since. There is a large school now, a very important school of theoretical physics, the so-called school of axiomatic field theory, which is based just on the fact that
distinctions which were entirely neglected by physicists, which are in a sense foreign to physicists, were pointed out by him and are now coming into great importance and may forward the theory to a much greater extent than I am sure even Johnny anticipated. The third type of contributions to physics which Neumann made is a direct one. He solved certain physical problems. I don't mean principally small physical problems, but one very big one. The statistical interpretation of quantum mechanics, the understanding of what the quantum mechanical equations mean, was achieved, strangely enough, a good deal after these equations became known and were known as mathematical entities. He wrote a book about it, first in German, then it was translated into English, and it is called The Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. I would like to tell you a few anecdotes to illustrate the unusual speed of Janči's thinking. There was a puzzle in the 20s which became rather popular, and it dealt with two bicyclists cycling toward each other from the two ends of a 40-mile track. A swallow is supposed to fly off from the one cyclist toward the other and meet the other cyclist, return to the first one, then go back to the second one and cover shorter and shorter distances. Well, the problem is, what is the total distance of the swallow's flight? The speed of the bicyclist was 20 miles and the speed of the swallow is 50 miles per hour. One can arrive at the solution of the problem rather quickly by noting that the two bicyclists will take just 1 hour to meet, because they start at opposite ends of a 40-mile track and have a speed of 20 miles each. During an hour, naturally, the swallow flies 50 miles because it's 50 miles per hour. Well, few people see the solution of this puzzle, and Johnny didn't see it either when Max Born, himself a very well-known scientist, a physicist, told him the story. In spite of this, by the time that Born finished the story, Johnny was ready with the answer. He said, well, 50 miles, of course. Born was astounded, and he said, you are the first one of my scientist friends who saw the solution at once. Johnny said, well, I can't understand that. It is a simple infinite geometrical series. And by the time Born finished with the story, evidently he had summed up the length of the infinitely many distances traversed by the swallow.
In 1930, sensing the disaster that was to overtake Europe, he accepted an invitation from Princeton University and became a guest lecturer on mathematical physics. That same year, he married Mariette Covesi, and in 1935, a daughter, Marina, was born. The marriage terminated in divorce. In 1938, during a summer visit to Budapest, he met and married Clara Dahn and brought her back to Princeton. Clary von Neumann learned mathematics from her husband and years later became one of the first coders of mathematical problems for electronic computing machines. When the Institute for Advanced Study was formed in 1933, von Neumann was appointed as one of the 4 original professors on its permanent faculty, along with Einstein, Alexander, and Veblen. In the early years, the intense scientific atmosphere attracted some of the most brilliant mathematicians and physicists ever concentrated in a single place and time. The von Neumann house was a gathering place for them in a round of memorable parties. Herman Feil and his wife, Niels Bohr, Marston and Louise Morse, von Bargmann, Artin and his wife, Natasha, Oswald Veblen, James Alexander, Bertrand Russell, Harry Smythe, Arthur Kestler, and Oskar Morgenstern, who remembers.
There was one evening party where Einstein appeared. It was the only time I've ever seen Einstein wear a tuxedo, but he didn't wear socks even then. The parties at Johnny's house were a mixture of instant scientific discussion and then complete irrelevance. You went there with a light feeling every time, because there was a spirit of freedom in that house, and it was really wonderful. Whenever Johnny saw a funny hat, he'd put them on. He loved to be looked at, and he would show off to the ladies. He had one with a little contraption that made a noise when you blew into it, and a light would flash at the same time. It was one of those children's things, and he loved it. I never understood why it amused him so much, but it certainly did.
In the late 1930s, von Neumann's work in pure mathematics reached its zenith with his investigations into measure, operator, and ergodic theory. Paul Halmos of the University of Michigan describes this work.
I first met von Neumann in 1939. That was 10 years after he'd already established his reputation as the leading scientist in operator theory in Hilbert space. I went to the Institute for Advanced Study to work with him on ergodic theory, and I was his assistant for a couple of years, 1940 and 1941. In ergodic theory, which has physical motivation, there was an unsolved problem, the ergodic hypothesis, which mathematicians and physicists have tried for years to express precisely and to prove. And nothing happened till in the late 1920s, or early 1930. B.O. Koopman of Columbia made a brilliant observation that geometric physical subject can be expressed in terms of the language that von Neumann was an expert in terms of operator theory in Hilbert space. And although I didn't know him then, I can practically see Johnny just saying, if it's operator theory, I can do it. And he did it. What he did, in its crudest and most physical expression, can perhaps be described by a sack of marbles. Say we have 100 marbles, 99 black and 1 white, that we shake. And as we shake it, the white one moves and jiggles around. If we keep our eye on any particular part of the sack of marbles, say the bottom third, we see the white one going in there and going out, bouncing back and forth. And we expect that on the average, it spends a third of its life in the bottom third of the sack. In the same way, to take a continuous example, suppose we have a cup of black coffee and a drop of cream floating on top. If we gently stir the mixture, there's some black still on the bottom, some white still on top, but it begins gradually to spread through, and as the stirring goes on, it assumes a homogeneous dark brown color. Koopman's observation amounts to this, that the stirring, the permutation of the sack of marbles, can be described by a matrix with 100 rows and 100 columns, and the property that in each row and in each column there is exactly 1, 1, all the rest being zeros. If such a matrix is M, then the averaging property of the shaking of the sack of marbles is described by forming the average M plus M squared plus and so on up to M to the N over N. And the assertion about the marble spending a third of its life in the bottom third becomes a theorem about the limit of the sequence of averages. And in the same way, the coffee example can be studied in terms of a unitary operator U, the appropriate generalization of a matrix, on an infinite dimensional instead of a 100-dimensional Hilbert space, and the uniform brownness of the cup of coffee is a property of the average U plus U squared plus U to the N over N, and the limit of that as N becomes infinite. The precise formulation and proof of this result, which is known as the mean ergodic theorem, is von Neumann's accomplishment in this direction. Shortly thereafter, inspired by it, G.D. Birkhoff presented a different version, and the subject has been extensively studied and investigated since then, here and abroad, in the Soviet Union and elsewhere. Von Neumann used operator theory to study spectral theory, to study ergodic theory, and he used ergodic theory as the motivation for and as the construction of basic examples in operator theory. He used operator theory also in his physical studies of quantum mechanics. When he was thinking about quantum mechanics, he could think as a physicist and be sloppy with the best of them. When he was thinking of operator theory, and in particular his special invention, rings of operators, he could be as precise and careful and algebraic as the best. Rings of operators, by the way, have come to be known as von Neumann algebras. One of the most startling and original contributions von Neumann made comes from the theory of rings of operators. If we study a finite dimensional, say 100-dimensional Euclidean space, then to say that the subspace of it is 50-dimensional is just as well described by saying that it has half the dimension of the whole space. And to say that it is 75-dimensional is the same as to say that it occupies 3/4 of the dimension of the space. So the dimensions may be described by percentages, say, running between 0 100ths and 100 100ths. In connection with various rings of operators, von Neumann introduced dimension functions in continuous geometries where the dimensions could take any value between 0 and 1, so it makes sense to speak of a subspace of dimension 1 over pi. People often want to know what made von Neumann so great. What made it possible for him to make so many contributions in so many different parts of mathematics? I don't know. It's easy enough to say that he worked hard. He worked very hard. There is a sort of a thread running through von Neumann's work. It's hard to say what it is, but essentially it was his genius at synthesizing and analyzing things. He could take large units, rings of operators, measures, continuous geometries, direct integrals, and express the unit in terms of infinitesimal little bits, and vice versa. He could take infinitesimal little bits and put together, glue together, by means of them, large units with arbitrarily prescribed properties. That's what a lot of modern mathematics is about. That's what Johnny could do, and what no one else could do as well.
Oskar Morgenstern, economist, Princeton University.
I went to Princeton in 1938, partly because von Neumann was there, and I was acquainted with some of his work, particularly his paper of 1928 on game theory, which had until then been quite neglected. I was quite convinced of its importance for the social sciences because it proved that important minimax theorem. And so I decided to draft a paper and showed it to von Neumann. And he said it was too short. It should be expanded. I did that. He looked at it again. He said, fine, why don't we write a joint paper? And so we started. And out of this joint paper came, in a period of the most intensive work I've ever known, the book which we finally published in 1944. We used to meet at the Nassau Club virtually every morning. His wife liked to sleep longer, and I was unmarried then and had my breakfast there, and he would join me. We continued to meet there even long after the book had come out. It was a wonderful way to start the day, always full of discussions about the events of the day. Many scientific matters came up, and it was a wonderful, never-forgotten period. He loved the wide open spaces, so we often went to Sigurd. not to swim because he didn't like that kind of exercise, but to walk along the beach. We had very serious discussions, and these walks sort of crystallized them. Then we would go home and write down things. That was a normal way of working. This sort of walking in the open air seems to help mental activity. He wasn't a man who sat and studied hard. He would think all the time, and when it was ready in his mind, it came rushing up. He worked with tremendous energy and fantastic speed. I've seen him write 30 pages in one day. He worked almost anywhere, any hotel room, train, wherever he was.
The remarkable thing about my association with von Neumann is perhaps that he, as a mathematician, could so quickly and easily penetrate into the problems of economics and sociology which I presented to him. That is very indicative of his basic philosophy, which was that mathematics should try to enter new areas, new fields, not only be inspired as it had been by the natural sciences. He expected that it would receive great stimulus from the other areas. And I'm sure that if he had lived, he would have made great contributions also, for example, to biology, in which field he was very much interested. But out of this study of sociology and economics on the one side and mathematics on the other came this book, which is the fruit of our joint association.
The Theory of Games was a landmark work in pointing the way toward the mathematization of human motivations. The theory deals with problems ranging from the two-person game, in which the goals of individuals are diametrically opposed, as in poker and war, to n-person games involving complex interaction of groups, and finally to insights into individual choice, as it is expressed in economics. In 1943, von Neumann was one of those who disappeared into the West to work on the Manhattan Project. Los Alamos, at that time, was a unique mixture of primitive living conditions, super secrecy, and brilliant scientific minds, all of which combined to create an atmosphere of intense excitement and stimulation. Von Neumann took part in most of the crucial stages of the bomb's development and was present at the detonation of the first A-bomb at the Trinity site. Nobel Prize winner Hans Bethe, leader of the Theoretical Physics Division in Los Alamos, 1943 to 1946.
In Los Alamos, in 1943, we had the problem of assembling uranium to make an atomic bomb. Dr. von Neumann was a consultant to the laboratory and visited us about 3 times a year for a week or 2 at a time. There were 2 methods being considered. One was to shoot the parts of the bomb together by a gun, and the other method was the so-called implosion, in which you surround the bomb material by high explosive and then explode this explosive so that the metal of the bomb would assemble in a sphere. In the beginning of the Los Alamos laboratory, only the first method seemed to be possible. It was von Neumann who told us and encouraged us to try the second, and who gave us a lot of information on similar work which had been done under his supervision at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, in which shaped charges had been developed. He was very positive that an implosion could be developed, and he told us that this would have added advantages for the assembly which we had not realized. One of the advantages which we had realized was that the implosion would bring the material together much faster and therefore would prevent detonation of the weapon before full assembly. Another advantage which he pointed out was that the implosion might squeeze the material and might thereby increase the efficiency of the weapon. Even after his encouragement, however, we still found it very difficult to assemble the material by implosion. There were experiments made under the leadership of Dr. Kistiakowsky of Harvard to study the explosive method without the uranium being around. And unfortunately, they gave all sorts of irregular shapes. Well, this did not trouble von Neumann at all. He suggested to us that we use something to focus the implosion, focus in a similar way as light is focused by a lens. And this device, in fact, has been called an explosive lens. Afterwards, he designed for us some configuration of explosive lenses which actually worked and which was finally used in the assembly that we used for the first bomb in Trinity and afterwards in Nagasaki.
Von Neumann loved Los Alamos. The spectacular scenery, the magnificent climate, and the many friendships drew him back again and again. He would go along with friends on anything, from a mule trip into the mountains to a set of tennis with Stan Ulam, but always in his Oxford gray business suit. During the period he was working in Los Alamos, von Neumann became intensely interested in computers. Dr. Herman Goldstine, now of the IBM Corporation, was one of his earliest collaborators in this work. In the spring of 1966, Dr. Goldstine was invited to visit a warehouse of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where the original Princeton computer is stored. He was accompanied by Dr. Uta Merzebach of the Smithsonian staff.
Oh, these things would have fascinated Johnny. He used to love toys. When he worked on the on his automata theory at the beginnings, he started, since he had to make three-dimensional objects, he bought the biggest Tinker toy set that he could find, and he made the objects out of these until we showed him one time how to make these two-dimensionally, so he was able to give the Tinker toys to Morgenstern's son.
Oh, really?
Yes. Well, as Johnny would have said, mercy. Here it is. All these years. May I move the curtain?
Would you?
Sure, be glad to. Let's see what it looks like. If I can do it. Very good. I succeeded.
There you are.
Yes.
I need to know.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstine.
This machine was the concrete embodiment of von Neumann's very great ideas and contributions which he has made to the electronic computer field. In 1946, Johnny asked me if I would join him at the end of the war in Princeton and help him to carry out in concrete form the ideas which he had been working on in 1944 and 1945. Of course, I jumped at the chance. We rushed to Princeton and got started. The machine that eventuated from that is the one you see here, and it contains essentially those things which the modern computer has in it, although in somewhat primitive form. This machine has stored program concept as its major feature, and that, in fact, is the thing which makes the modern computer revolution possible. The older machines required one to clumsily perform hand pluggings of connections which took hours, indeed days. It meant that programming was an art, in fact, a very black art, and furthermore, it meant that the total number of instructions one could write were comparatively small. This new concept has been carried so far today that programs are written involving tens of millions of instructions, whereas in those days, of course, nobody dreamed of such complexity, but Johnny's idea made this basically possible. What is the stored program concept? Well, it's the notion that you can describe in a finite number of words, in fact, a fairly small number of words, in a fairly simple language, exactly and unequivocally the description of a problem, and that this description is then translated into binary digits and stored in the memory of the computer exactly as numbers are stored. This was the discovery by Johnny. You may say, what's so remarkable about that? Well, the only thing I can tell you in answer to that is it's just like the wheel. What's so remarkable about the wheel? When you look at it, you can't conceive how anybody would not have known that there was one. Indeed, it must have been that the moment somebody mentioned the wheel or somebody mentioned the stored program, everybody around us obviously knew that this was the way to do it. And in fact, we accepted it immediately. It was not one of these inventions or discoveries which is enormously complicated and few people can understand. It's tremendously simple. It immediately hits a person and he knows that's it. Now, this, I believe, was his great discovery. And curiously enough, it relates back in a very interesting way to his very early mathematical works, which were in the domain of formal logics. He, however, had other interests, and I think his second great contribution to the computing field lay in his work at Los Alamos in showing the experimental people there how it was possible by mathematical modeling to formulate the problems with which they were grappling in mathematical form, indeed in systems of partial differential equations which express the conservation laws of hydrodynamics. And then to translate those complicated, implicit equations into explicit, finite systems of difference equations. And these systems of difference equations then can be solved on the computer. And indeed, this is the reason why initially he had this great interest in the computer. But you see, it led him to develop many of the things in numerical analysis that we know today. Now, the third thing, really, which he did for the field was to bring his great prestige to the subject, to make the notion of computation stylish, if you will. He showed people that it's no longer necessary to do tedious experimentation, that it's possible much more conveniently to do experiments, if you will, on the computer by numerical techniques. I think in part he did this because he was very much of the computer himself. He had great facility at numerical processes. And in fact, I can tell you an anecdote which I think may interest you some. It happened down at Aberdeen early on during the war, and what he was doing then was consulting frequently at Aberdeen, coming on up to Philadelphia to talk with us about the ENIAC. Now, this particular day, in fact, the day prior to this one, a young mathematician who subsequently has become a famous person had come in with several colleagues, and we were talking about a problem with which he was grappling. And he was getting nowhere and asked our help. Well, none of us was able to do anything with it analytically. So he said, well, the heck with it. I'm going to take a computer, or Frieden, or Marchant, or Monroe home tonight, and I'm going to calculate a few special cases. And fine, he did. And the next morning he came in at 5:30 looking awful. He had bags under his eyes. He was fatigued. He was unshaved. He was, in fact, in very bad way, but he had triumphed. He had calculated the first 5 cases. And he was busy telling us about this when who should bust in but Johnny from Los Alamos. And he said, well, what's new, fellas? And we said, oh, well, so-and-so has been busy with the following idea, and he's in trouble with it. And he said, well, let's see what it's like. And he tried for a couple of minutes, and he said, no, he said, that's sort of intractable analytically. Let me see what's doing with this thing numerically. Let me evaluate a few cases. So he did. In about 1 minute, he threw his head back, and he said, 16.25. and you could hear the numbers rolling through his head. You could actually hear them. He was mumbling them. And in about a minute, he did the first case, and maybe a minute and a quarter the second, and a minute and a half the third, and 2 minutes the fourth. And he came then to the crucial case, the one which this fellow had spent his whole night working out. And this chap was very clever, and he listened closely to von Neumann as he was rolling through n equals 5. And when he judged he was about halfway through, he recognized a number, and he waited an instant, and then he said 26.75. And you could just see von Neumann kind of come to a shuddering halt. And he said, huh? And this boy said, 26.75, Professor von Neumann. And von Neumann said, just a minute. And he got very nervous, and he began to compute again, and you could hear the tempo going up much more than it had before. And after another minute, he said 26.75. Yes, he says, that's right. And whereupon this fellow ran out of the room because he couldn't stand it any longer, and I made childish chatter trying to keep von Neumann distracted while he paced up and down nervously, saying to himself, how could that guy have possibly done that? What trick? And after an hour or so, we finally told him. But at any rate, that's sufficient to illustrate his great ability as a computer himself and the great feeling he had for computation. This whole field owes so much to von Neumann's genius that it's really very difficult to tell you exactly what would have happened if this hadn't been built. I can only say that his stored program concept might not ever have been discovered by another person, or it might have taken many years before it was discovered, and almost as important as that, perhaps, not from a mathematician's point of view, but from a economic point of view, his great prestige as a mathematician sold the notion of the computer and its great importance to the industrialists and to the government officials who made this whole development possible.
The immense strides in computer technology that were spurred by von Neumann's work had as one result the speeding up of the development of the H-bomb. The reputation that von Neumann earned for his work during this period drew him more and more into contact with industry and government. By the early 1950s, he was devoting nearly all of his time as a high-level consultant to various governmental agencies. Some of his friends felt he spread himself too thin.
I wish he'd been more economical with his time in that respect. For example, if people called him to Washington or elsewhere, he would very readily go and so on. Instead of having these people come to him, it was much more important, I think, that he should have saved his time and effort. That he felt when the government called that one had to go. It was a patriotic duty. And as I said before, he was a very devoted citizen of the country here. And I think one of the things that particularly pleased him was any recognition which came sort of from the government. In fact, in that sense, I felt it sometimes somewhat peculiar that he would, be impressed by government officials or generals and so on. If a big uniform appeared, that made more of an impression than it should have done.
Yes,
it was odd. But it shows that he was a person of very many different and sometimes self-contradictory facets, I think.
In October 1954, John von Neumann was appointed as a member of the Atomic Energy Commission. But only a few months later, he was hospitalized with the cancer that was to end his life. Admiral Lewis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission during that period.
I remember one particular incident at Walter Reed Hospital, the Army Hospital here in Washington, when the Defense Department felt that it had to consult him. He was their chief scientific advisor on Air Force matters. And I recall the extraordinary picture of sitting beside the bed of this man in his 40s who had been an immigrant And there surrounding him were the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Secretaries of Air, Army, Navy, and the Chiefs of Staff.
Despite the pressures of his involvement in governmental work, von Neumann in his last years struck out boldly into the almost unexplored field of automata. His interest in this field first led him to consider the possibility of constructing reliable machines that would utilize unreliable components. He reasoned that if the human brain could continue to function well, even after some degree of damage, that a large and complex machine might be made to do the same. This is in sharp contrast to present-day computing machines, in which failure of a single component may lead the machine to produce results that are complete gibberish. But perhaps his most daring work in automata was his attempt to develop a machine not only capable of reproducing itself, but of an evolutionary process in which succeeding generations construct machines of increasing complexity. In his last work, The Computer and the Brain, von Neumann suggested that logic and mathematics in the central nervous system, when viewed as languages, must be structurally essentially different from any of the languages in our experience. It is ironic that, though his work in automata was left incomplete, the enormous possibilities that it opened up may yet prove to be his most significant contribution to science.
Von Neumann was many things. He was a mathematician, he was a physicist, a chemist, an economist, a human being, of course, and he tried to be more. Now, my point of view is prejudiced. I wanted him to be nothing but a mathematician. And in what I call mathematics, pure mathematics as distinguished from its physical applications, in that work he stopped functioning by the early or middle 1940s. And I don't think it was the war that had anything to do with it, or his subsequent illness. His interest changed. So I don't think if he had lived longer, he would have accomplished more along the lines of pure mathematics. But I think he could have if he had wanted to, if he devoted all of the long life to mathematics. He might have had a place with the all-time greats of mathematics. As it is, I sometimes think that though he was tremendous while he was alive and while he had a very important effect on the mathematics of this century, somehow 2 or 3 centuries from now, he will have become a relatively minor figure. He did not, I think, fulfill himself in the sense of using the talent that he had to its fullest. He spread it thinner than some people do. He had too much of it, perhaps, and that made for a peculiar wastage.
Some people felt that what he did was to cast about randomly, looking for new directions to move. But he really was not going in random directions at all. He was really seeking to see in which areas the tools of mathematics, which he had at his command, could be brought to bear to change some subject fundamentally from a non-mathematical to a mathematical one. I think it's fair to summarize his contributions by saying that what he did were very, very difficult things, they were very profound, and that they inevitably altered not only his own mathematical career, but that of mathematics itself.
Edward Teller, friend and colleague.
Many people have wondered how Johnny von Neumann could think so fast and so effectively. How he could find so many original solutions in areas where most people did not even notice. the problems. I think I know a part of the answer, perhaps an important part. Johnny von Neumann enjoyed thinking. I have come to suspect that to most people thinking is painful. Some of us are addicted to thinking. Some of us find it a necessity. Johnny enjoyed it. I even have the suspicion that he enjoyed practically nothing else. This explains a lot, because what you like, you do well. And he liked thinking, not just in mathematics. He liked thinking in the clear and complete manner of mathematicians, in every field. In mathematics, in physics, in the business world, his father was a banker. In many other fields. He could and did talk to my 3-year-old son on his own terms. And I sometimes wondered whether his relation to the rest of us were a little bit similar. This also explains his effectiveness in connection with computing machines. Because computing machines apply logical processes to fields, not only mathematics, but to others as yet untouched by the logical process. And it is very significant that this revolution, the revolution of the electronic brains, was practically initiated by Johnny von Neumann. I cannot think of Johnny now without remembering a very tragic circumstance. When he was dying of cancer, his brain was affected. I visited him frequently, and he was trying to do what he always tried to do. And he was trying to argue with me, as he used to. And it wasn't functioning anymore. And I think that he suffered from this loss more than I have seen any human to suffer in any other circumstance.